15 times King Charles clashed with famous figures. King Charles III has crossed paths with countless famous figures from all walks of life. While many of these encounters were cordial, there have been several notable occasions where the king found himself at odds with high-profile individuals, leading to tense confrontations and public clashes. From fiery exchanges with outspoken celebrities to heated debates with political leaders, King Charles has never shied away from voicing his opinions and standing his ground, even in the face of formidable adversaries. In this video, we'll take a closer look at 15 of the most memorable times when King Charles locked horns with famous figures. Number 1. Margaret Thatcher. In the 1980s, King Charles found himself in a political tug-of-war with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady of British politics. Their clash centered primarily on environmental policies and social issues. King Charles, an early advocate for organic farming and sustainability, often criticized Thatcher's government for its lack of focus on environmental concerns. He saw her pro-business free market policies as detrimental to rural communities and the environment. Thatcher, in turn, viewed King Charles' interventions as naive and politically harmful to economic growth. Their disagreements extended to social issues as well. King Charles worried about the impact of Thatcher's policies on the poor and disenfranchised, a concern that put him at odds with her approach to welfare and community development. Number 2. Tony Blair. The clash between King Charles and Tony Blair, the Labour Prime Minister who promised a new Britain, was less ideological and more about specific policies. A significant point of contention was Blair's government's ban on fox hunting in 2004. King Charles, a keen horseman and advocate for rural traditions, saw the ban as an attack on the way of life in the countryside. He reportedly described it as a classic example of knee-jerk legislation. The conflict highlighted King Charles' deep connection to rural issues and his role as a defender of traditional country pursuits. Beyond fox hunting, King Charles and Blair often found themselves at odds over rural affairs more broadly. King Charles criticized what he saw as the government's urban-centric policies, arguing they neglected the needs of farmers and rural communities. Despite these disagreements, their relationship wasn't entirely antagonistic. Blair respected King Charles' passion for causes like sustainable development and interfaith dialogue. Still, their clashes underscored the challenge of balancing royal advocacy with government policy. Number 3. Donald Trump. While not a direct confrontation, the contrast between King Charles' environmental advocacy and former U.S. President Donald Trump's climate skepticism created a palpable tension. King Charles has been a vocal champion for action on climate change since the 1970s, long before it became a mainstream concern. He's given speeches, written books, and even created an organic brand to promote sustainable living. Trump, on the other hand, has called climate change a hoax and withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Agreement. Their divergent views came to a head during Trump's 2019 state visit to the UK. King Charles extended their scheduled 15-minute chat to a 90-minute discussion primarily focused on climate change. While both parties described the talk as friendly, it was clear they left with their views intact. Trump later commented that King Charles wants to make sure future generations have a good climate as opposed to a disaster, but he remained unconvinced by the king's arguments. This interaction highlighted King Charles' willingness to engage even the most skeptical leaders on issues he deems critical. Number 4. Rupert Murdoch. King Charles' clash with media mogul Rupert Murdoch isn't about a personal feud, but rather the broader issue of media scrutiny and privacy. The flashpoint was the so-called Black Spider memos, a collection of King Charles' private letters to government ministers advocating for his pet causes. These letters, nicknamed for King Charles' distinctive handwriting, were subject to a decade-long legal battle initiated by the Guardian newspaper. While the Guardian isn't owned by Murdoch, the case symbolizes King Charles' fraught relationship with the British media, much of which Murdoch controls. Murdoch's tabloids, like The Sun and now defunct News of the World, have often targeted the royal family with invasive coverage. King Charles sees this as an intrusion into private matters and a distraction from the serious issues he wants to discuss. The Black Spider memos case was particularly galling because it exposed his behind-the-scenes advocacy. which some saw as improper meddling by a future king. This episode underscores the tightrope King Charles walks, passionate about his causes, but constrained by expectations of royal neutrality, all under the unforgiving glare of a media landscape heavily influenced by figures like Murdoch. Number 5. Boris Johnson. The tension between King Charles and Boris Johnson, the charismatic and controversial former Prime Minister, centers largely on environmental issues. King Charles has been a consistent advocate for bold action on climate change, biodiversity loss, and sustainable development. Johnson, however, has had a more mercurial relationship with these issues. As Mayor of London, he expressed skepticism about climate science. Later, as PM, he committed the UK to ambitious carbon reduction targets, but faced criticism for policies that seemed to undermine these goals, like cutting air passenger taxes. This inconsistency frustrates King Charles, who sees climate change as an existential threat requiring unwavering commitment. Their indirect clash came to a head in 2021 when King Charles addressed world leaders at COP26 in Glasgow, urging bold and decisive action. Johnson, as host, talked up the UK's green credentials, but faced accusations of greenwashing. While they've never publicly criticized each other, their differing approaches to this critical issue highlight the challenge of aligning political expediency with long-term environmental stewardship. Number 6. Jeremy Clarkson. The clash between King Charles and Jeremy Clarkson, the outspoken former host of Top Gear, epitomizes the culture war over environmentalism. Clarkson, known for his love of powerful cars and disdain for eco-mentalists, has repeatedly mocked King Charles' environmental advocacy. He once quipped that King Charles' suggestion for people to leave their cars at home was like a food critic telling us not to eat food. Clarkson sees King Charles' calls for reduced carbon footprints as an attack on personal freedom and the automotive industry he champions. King Charles, in contrast, views sustainable transport as crucial for combating climate change. He's not just talk. He's converted his Aston Martin to run on surplus wine and cheese byproducts. This practical step infuriated Clarkson, who called it a load of old rubbish. Their clash goes beyond cars. It's about conflicting visions of progress. King Charles sees sustainability as the future, while Clarkson romanticizes a high-octane, high-emission past. Number 7. Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage, the Brexit champion and former leader of the UK Independence Party, hasn't directly confronted King Charles, but their worldviews are on a collision course. Farage's brand of nationalism, skepticism of global institutions, and hardline stance on immigration starkly contrast with King Charles' internationalist outlook. King Charles has long advocated for interfaith dialogue, multiculturalism, and global cooperation on issues like climate change. In a 2020 speech, he warned against the aggressive nationalism that Farage embodies. Farage, in turn, has criticized the royal family for not being vocal enough in support of Brexit, a project he sees as restoring British sovereignty. King Charles' environmental work also puts him at odds with Farage. The King's support for EU environmental regulations and his warning that Brexit could undermine climate action are anathema to Farage's vision of a deregulated UK. Their indirect clash underscores a broader rift in British society, between those who see the future in global partnerships and those who prioritize national autonomy. Number 8. Vladimir Putin. In 2014, during a visit to Canada, King Charles reportedly likened Putin's actions in Ukraine to those of Hitler in the 1930s. This comparison, referencing Putin's annexation of Crimea, caused a diplomatic uproar. The Russian embassy demanded an official explanation, and British politicians scrambled to downplay the remarks. But King Charles' comment, though private, reflects his long-standing advocacy for democracy and human rights. He's a patron of several organizations that promote these values globally, a stance that inherently clashes with Putin's authoritarian rule. Their tension isn't just political. King Charles is a committed environmentalist, while Putin leads a nation heavily dependent on fossil fuel exports and slow to act on climate change. Additionally, King Charles' support for the restoration of looted art, including pieces taken by Nazis and Soviets, puts him at odds with Putin's narrative of Russian historical grievances. While they've met cordially at official events, their fundamental values remain irreconcilable. Number 9. JeanMarie Le Pen. Le Pen is known for his anti-immigrant, anti-EU stance and has been accused of anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. King Charles, conversely, has championed multiculturalism and interfaith understanding. He's patron of the Oxford Centre for Islamic Studies and has spoken passionately about the value of cultural diversity in Britain. In a 2006 speech, King Charles warned against the disturbing rise of intolerance, a clear rebuke to figures like Le Pen. The king's support for the Refugee Council and his visits to various ethnic and religious communities in the UK stand in stark opposition to Le Pen's vision of a monocultural Europe. While they've never directly engaged, their clash is ideological, a battle between King Charles' vision of a harmonious, diverse society and Le Pen's exclusionary nationalism. Number 10. Rod Liddle. The sparring between King Charles and journalist Rod Liddle centers on an unlikely battleground: architecture. Liddle, a provocative columnist for The Spectator and The Sunday Times, has lambasted King Charles for his interventions in architectural projects. The prince is known for his strong opinions on urban planning, favoring traditional classical styles over modernist designs. He once famously described a proposed extension to the National Gallery as a monstrous carbuncle. Liddle sees these interventions as overreach by an unelected royal. He's accused King Charles of using his influence to bully architects and planning committees into rejecting innovative designs. Liddle argues that King Charles' taste is stifling creativity and holding British architecture back. King Charles, however, believes that traditional design fosters a sense of place and community. He's put his ideas into practice with Poundbury, his model village in Dorset. For Liddle, it's a feudal Disneyland. Number 11. Richard Rogers. Rogers, a pioneer of high-tech architecture known for buildings like the Centre Pompidou in Paris, found himself directly in King Charles' crosshairs over the redevelopment of Chelsea Barracks in London. In 2009, King Charles privately lobbied the Qatari royal family, who owned the site, to scrap Rogers' modernist design. He called it unsuitable and pushed for a more traditional plan. Rogers was furious, accusing King Charles of overstepping his constitutional role and using his royal influence to undermine the planning process. The Qataris withdrew Rogers' plan, leading to a £68 million lawsuit. This incident sparked a broader debate about King Charles' architectural interventions. Rogers and other architects argued that King Charles' preference for pastiche classicism was stifling innovation. They saw his actions as an abuse of power that could have a chilling effect on the profession. King Charles, however, maintained that he was giving voice to public concerns about soulless modern developments. Number 12. Frank Gehry. Gehry's deconstructivist style, with its swooping titanium curves and fragmented forms, represents everything King Charles has rallied against. The king once described modern architecture as heartless and soulless, a clear swipe at avant-garde designs like Gehry's. In response, Gehry's criticized King Charles' interventions as archaic and detrimental to architectural progress. He argues that King Charles' promotion of neoclassical styles is a regression, a theme park version of the past, unsuited to contemporary needs. Their clash came to a head when King Charles criticized plans for modern additions to Gehry's Serpentine Gallery in London. Gehry accused the prince of visual dictatorship, arguing that his influence was pushing British architecture towards timidity and conformity. Number 13. The Chinese government. King Charles has long been a supporter of the Dalai Lama, Tibet's spiritual leader, whom China views as a separatist threat. This support has taken various forms. King Charles has met with the Dalai Lama several times. He's patron of Tibet-related charities, and he's spoken out about the preservation of Tibetan culture. These actions have repeatedly angered Beijing, which sees Tibet as an integral part of China. The clash came to a head in 1999 when King Charles boycotted a state banquet for then-President Jiang Zemin, reportedly because the Dalai Lama wasn't invited. This diplomatic snub caused a significant chill in UK-China relations. More recently, leaked journals revealed King Charles' private description of Chinese officials as appalling old waxworks, further straining ties. The Chinese government has accused King Charles of meddling in internal affairs. Number 14. The BBC. On one hand, the BBC provides a platform for King Charles' advocacy, broadcasting his speeches on climate change and interviews about his charitable work. On the other hand, it's also the source of some of his greatest frustrations. The tension peaked with the BBC's 1994 documentary and Princess Diana's infamous Panorama interview in 1995. King Charles felt these programs sensationalized his marital troubles and undermined his public role. More recently, he's been irked by the BBC's coverage of his Black Spider memos and accusations of meddling in politics. There's also an institutional clash. King Charles has criticized the BBC's dumbing down of cultural programming, arguing it should uphold higher standards. Number 15. The European Union. As a royal, he's officially neutral on political issues like Brexit. However, his long-standing environmental and agricultural initiatives often put him indirectly at odds with EU policies. For instance, King Charles has been a vocal critic of EU subsidies that he believes incentivize intensive, unsustainable farming. His Duchy Originals brand promotes smaller-scale organic agriculture, a model somewhat at odds with the EU's common agricultural policy. On environmental issues, King Charles has sometimes found the EU both an ally and a frustration. He's praised EU directives on renewable energy and biodiversity, but criticized the slow pace of action on climate change. The EU's approach to GM crops also clashes with King Charles' staunch opposition. Post-Brexit, these tensions have evolved. King Charles has expressed concern that leaving the EU could undermine environmental protections. Yet he's also optimistic that an independent UK could lead on sustainable development. This complex relationship reflects King Charles' pragmatic environmentalism, working with or critiquing institutions based on their alignment with his green agenda. Well, there you have it, folks. 15 moments when King Charles III found himself at odds with some of the most prominent figures of our time. From politicians and celebrities to royals and activists, His Majesty certainly hasn't shied away from speaking his mind, even if it meant ruffling a few feathers along the way. Let us know your thoughts on these clashes in the comments down below. Which one surprised you the most? Do you think King Charles was justified in his actions? Or did he overstep at times? We'd love to hear your perspectives. And while you're down there, don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed this video and consider sharing it with your friends and family. It helps the channel out tremendously. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss our latest uploads. We've got plenty more royal content coming your way. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.